Greetings. My name is Veronica Heiskell. I'm Director of Experiential Learning and Student Employment at Career Success. And I'm excited to share with you how to write a CV with a little bit of content about what makes a CV different than a resume and what you might add if you're hoping to transition your CV into a resume. We're first going to cover what makes a CV versus a resume, then enter the basics of CV writing, cover some resources, and briefly end with some job search tips and techniques for those of you who are planning to go the academic job search or potentially the non-academic job search. Because this is a pre-recording, there won't be time for your questions, but of course, I encourage you to reach out to Career Success if you do have any follow-up questions. So when it comes to putting together our professional materials, we typically need either an academic CV, that's most typical for applying for faculty jobs or lecturer positions. Administrative CVs are more common if you're applying to higher level administrative roles at universities. Industry CVs are becoming more common as folks transition from the academy to roles outside of the academy and industry that are looking for folks with extensive research experience. And of course, resumes. Most jobs outside of the academy will have an expectation for a resume, but again, we'll talk about why you would prepare each individual type and what are some of the differences between these materials as we go along. So let's talk differences between CVs and resumes. So CVs are going to be an incredibly exhaustive description of your educational experiences. It's one of the most different components is that a CV is many pages, typically unlimited pages technically, and you're tailoring your CV to the institutional type that you're applying to. Meaning if you're applying to a heavy research intensive type of faculty role, you'll have a different structure to your CV than if you're applying to a more teaching focused institution or position. CVs are commonly used for the academic job search and they are used internationally as well. Resumes are much more focused. So a resume, you are tailoring ideally to a specific job description. You're limiting just the most relevant experience for that particular role that you're applying to. It's typically 1 to 2 pages max and most commonly used for industry job search. So if we think about the core differences, right, the resume is going to be much more focused, much more specific to what you're applying to. The CV is going to be specific to the type of institution you're applying to and will typically be much longer and more descriptive. I did say there were differences, but I do want to highlight that there are so many more similarities than there are differences between these types of documents. So first and foremost, you want humans to read these documents, whether it's a CV or a resume. And what helps us to read a document is when it doesn't feel overwhelming. So the use of white space is really powerful in enabling us to know where to go in terms of reading your document and to feel like you're not overwhelmed with the amount of text on a page. I think we've all opened documents where the margins are really, really small, the text is small, and it just feels quite overwhelming. Does it make you want to read it? Considering what we're trying to do with the CV or resume, the goal is that this recruiter or person will read it, right? That they will take a look at it, read it, and consider you. The second is that both documents are really built on your audience, right? And what goes into them, how you structure them is based on who's going to read them. And that is not unique amongst CVs or resumes, right? Now, what that means for the makeup of the CV versus the resume, there are some differences. In English, we read top to bottom, left to right. So the most valuable areas in our documents are going to be top left, which is true of CVs and resumes both. And that's why we utilize a certain structure to make it easy to read, so that we're structuring so that the most important components are at the beginning of the CV, especially given how long of a document it is. Similar for resumes, the most important components are towards the top of our resume. Now, this is controversial. I think it depends on who you talk to and what their expectations are, but I personally find long paragraphs hard to read. And I think most humans do. So with these documents, especially with resumes, but I would also encourage you to take that feedback when you're looking at a CV, is to not write long paragraphs, right? You're aiming for readability. Even if you've done all sorts of things, you're thinking about how can I distill what I've done into something that is readable and easy to understand for most individuals. And that means you might be using things like bullets. Now, bullets, again, like I said, are not always common on CVs, but I can tell you my CV absolutely has bullets on it. I do come from a more administrative CV background, but when I did my doctorate, the majority of folks in the program were entering the faculty or the academic job market. So many of those individuals were also utilizing bullets because they really do help you to distill down information and make it easier to read. So what do bullets do? They start with a strong action verb. They're not a full sentence. They're describing what you did, what skills you gained, and how you were effective, quantifying or qualifying whenever possible. And finally, I highly encourage you to avoid templates for either document unless you're using a vetted template. And what I mean by a vetted template is a template that's on our website or a template that's on a career website across the country. Now, why we say avoid templates is because templates often have a lot of hidden formatting that makes it really challenging if your information does not exactly match up with the information of the person who initially built that template. Some templates will get in the way of the applicant tracking system's ability to scan if you're applying to industry. We're not going to go into that too in depth, but the key here is if you're wondering what should I do? How should I structure my CV or my resume? For resumes, the best starting point is to look at folks in industry or to take a look at some of the samples on our website for career success. For CVs, the same thing, but who's in your industry? It's like, think of your faculty chair or your faculty advisor or folks that you respect in your field. Take a look at how their CVs are structured. Now, the other agreed upon similarities is around formatting. Now, when it comes to CV, it's important to remember that you have room. You are not limited to 1 or 2 pages. So on resumes, you can technically go down to a 1/2 inch margin. I still think 1 inch looks better, but again, it's what's going to be functional for fitting the most relevant information on that page. For a CV, I would not go past a 1 inch margin, right? You have many pages you can use. So your readability is honestly even more important because it's so many pages. Your font, generally 11 or 12 point is preferred. You go smaller than that, it starts to get harder and harder to view. Now, this is dependent on the type of font you use. So we see an example of a serif and a sans serif font on this page. Serifs have a serif, which is a tiny line. So you see on the S, there's a kind of tiny line. If you're using a serif font, you really can't go past 12 because the more that you shrink it, the harder it is to read. Sans serifs have come into a lot of popularity because they're far easier to read. It's easier to shrink them down and still maintain legibility. But I still would encourage you to not go past an 11 with a sans serif font. Think of who your audience is, who's reading this, and try to be kind to their eyes. Now, for CVs, you absolutely need to include page numbers, often in your footer. I don't care how it's formatted, but you just want to make it easy so that if someone has printed out your document and they're searching through, trying to make sure it's you, most people will include their initials or their name and a number at the bottom of each page. And that makes it easy for you to track what document they're looking at. Now, I get that not everyone is going to print out your materials, but I would say on the CV side, especially if you're in an academic search, some folks may have a preference to print out the materials as they review them. What's typical for everything? You're going to have headers, right? Experience, for example, and your name. All of that is going to be in a bold font. So those are the things you really want to stand out and to make it easy to read. And finally, you are typically going to be sending these in PDFs to maintain your formatting in case someone doesn't have the same operating system or version of whatever you use to build these materials that you do. So now I want to briefly talk about some of the common sections in resumes and how it might be slightly different, but I want to emphasize slightly different than what you would include in your CV. So typically, I've bolded the portions that are absolutely required for any resume. You're always going to have your name and contact info at the top. Your education, for you, it's likely going to be at the top, right after your contact info. as you gain more experience, it's either at the top or the bottom. Most of us who have masters or PhDs, it remains at the top because it continues to be a pretty important component of what skill sets you bring for that industry area. And then experience. An experience can be any of the things discussed below, right? Any kind of experience that you've gained, whether it's in or outside of the classroom, full-time jobs, part-time jobs, internships, experiential learning opportunities, all sorts of stuff. You'll also notice a headline or summary, and I will show you that in just a moment. So you'll have a look at what those are, because those are the most dissimilar from a CV. And then you'll see the rest of this looks very similar to the sections in a CV, right? You might be including things like community service, leadership, certifications, licensure, awards, recognition, PD, skill sets, right? So there's a lot of sections that you might be able to utilize that you'll notice are often included on a CV. Now, very briefly, I know that some of you may never create a resume and you can skip this portion, but for those of you who think I might be open to doing the alt academic job search, a headline or summary is a really helpful tool when you have a lot of experience. So you'll notice that typically, as I said, resumes go about 1 to 2 pages, and you usually earn a new page of your resume after about 10 years of experience within a field-ish. Depends on the field. Some fields, it's really common for you to just have 1 page forever. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, how does one person who's worked for 20 or 30 years in the field work with just 1 or 2 pages? And the answer is a headline or summary. It is a way to make it easy for a recruiter to quickly glance and determine your skill sets, and if you have the appropriate skill sets for the position, if you tailored your materials within that first 10 seconds, essentially, of glancing at your resume. So you include a headline that is typically marketing you, even if you're pivoting, right? If it's not an industry that you've worked in extensively, you can still demonstrate that you have that kind of experience and what you're hoping to do, as long as you tie it back to what you've already done and how those transferable skills will help you in that industry. You'll then see the use of skills. This is really important, especially if you are entering an industry that has lots of key search terms, essentially, in their job descriptions, lots of qualifications. This is a good way to demonstrate your ability to meet those qualifications at top, and then you can demonstrate them all throughout your resume and your experience section. And finally, you might include a couple of sentences. That would be the summary that summarizes what you've done. Most of us, as we move on in our careers, we are focusing less on what we did or what skills you gained. We're really moving to how we were effective. And that's really what you see throughout the resume. So that was a brief peek. If you have more questions about this, I absolutely encourage you to follow up with a career engagement specialist to talk about this more in depth. But now let's talk CVs, right? So we've talked a little bit about resumes. If you have more questions about resumes, there's lots of resources on our website that I would encourage you to take a look at. When it comes to CVs, you'll notice that the basic structure is very similar to a resume. Contact information, education, always going to be at the top. And then professional experience could be comprised of many different sections. And you'll notice that you are likely to have specific sections within professional experience. So professional experience is probably not going to be a title, one of your header or categories. You're probably going to have research experience, teaching experience, relevant publications or peer-reviewed publications, etc. And I'll show you a bunch of examples so you can take a look and see what it looks like in action. This is really where I encourage you to take a look at your advisor or other folks in your field. Look at their CVs and see what they're utilizing as their categories, right? Or their headers. And that will help you to figure out what you want to have and what kind of experiences you might want to seek out as you continue on here at UCSC to continue to build out your experience. Now, I do want to caution you, when you look at your advisor's CV, you're likely comparing yourself to someone who's worked in the field for many, many years and has many publications potentially. I encourage you to be kind to yourself in this process. Know that you are just starting out in your research journey, likely. So it's helpful to remember you're looking at their materials for how is it structured, what kind of language do they utilize? Not necessarily, I have to have all of this experience in order to get a tenure track job. That is not necessarily true. So we've talked the basic structure. Now, of that experience, what typically is included in experience? Well, here's a bunch of options that we'll be going through. So sometimes you'll include information about your dissertation. This might be under an education section, it might be under your research section. You'll see examples of how folks have included it in different examples that I'll share with you. We know that research and teaching experiences are definitely going to be included on everyone's CV, publications of some kind, and you may have refereed publications or peer-reviewed publications, journal articles. The language you use here is going to be dependent on your industry, on your academic field. Conference presentations, professional development presentations and workshops, grants and fellowships, honors and awards, and finally, service. So service is our favorite category. It might be at the university, within your department, or outside of the department. Think of this as like community service. What are you involved in? How are you giving back? So a couple tips before we dive into examples. And you're going to see lots of examples today, in addition to a book that I would recommend. Main tips. First, at minimum, you want to have two versions of your CV. One that is tailored towards research-intensive universities, and one that's targeted towards teaching-focused institutions. It's not going to be hugely different, I'll be honest. It's just the order of your categories will change. Now, as I've shared, I think a bunch of times now, learn what's typical for your department or discipline. My discipline was in higher education. It's not likely that the way that we structured our materials is exactly the same as your field. So I encourage you to take a look at your field, see what's typical. That will really help you in capturing your information. If you are applying to a research-intensive institution, you will likely need to separate out refereed articles, chapters, essays, and collections. Again, depends on your field, so that it's really clear to the folks what kind of research you've been engaging in and what your publications look like. If you have an article that's sent out, but you have not received any information yet, if it's accepted, you'll list them, but you're not going to list a journal name yet. If you get a revise and resubmit, or if it's accepted, you would then provide the journal name at that time. And you'll use the format that's typical in your discipline. So in my discipline, we use APA formatting. So now I'll show you a bunch of examples. So these are some older examples. The dates are going to be a little out of date. But we see here, this is an example of someone getting their master's in art education. So someone who is at the master's level, and then I'll show you a bunch of PhD examples. So we see at the top, we've got name, contact info. Then we go immediately into education, and they're listing all of the universities that they've attended. If you've attended community college, you can even add that here if you'd like, especially if it's relevant to your research or relevant to your perspective as your pedagogy, right? Or relevant to the way that you see the world. They then list their thesis. You'll notice that they're not giving a ton of text. It's still fairly readable as they're listing it. You might alternatively list your dissertation similarly. They then list their research interests, their credentials, which are required in their industry area, and then go into experience. Now, you could make this teaching experience, so you could reconfigure the language here to make it more tailored. You'll notice the bullets here, though, are doing a good job of explaining not only what you did, the skill sets you gained, and how you were effective. So they're describing a variety of their experiences on their campus. So most of these are instruction. Again, that's why I would probably call this a teaching experience section. That's just me. You'll note that even on the CV, your order is in reverse chronological order, just like a resume. So the most recent experience that you've had is first, and so on and so forth. If your most recent experience is not the most relevant experience for the job, that's where you get to get creative in your titles that you use. So, right, conference presentations is a title. So let's say you wanted to feature something that you did that's not it's not the top of your experience section. Well, put any word in front of the word experience. You can create a new section where that experience is going to be first. And why do we do this? Think back to the tips we talked about. If we read top to bottom, left to right, we want to make sure the most important content is in that top area for folks to read. So we see conference presentations, brief descriptions here that may or may not be typical for your industry area. And then just conference attendance, fellowships or scholarships that they received, their academic and community service. You could just call this academic service, community service, up to you. And then professional affiliations. So as I mentioned, I highly recommend this Catherine Hume book, Surviving Your Academic Job Hunt, Advice for Humanities PhDs. This book is pretty exhaustive, and you may find other books out there, but this was the one recommended to me when I was on the search. So I'm going to show you a variety of examples that are in this book. I do not own these examples. I encourage you to consider checking this book out from the library if you'd like to go deeper. So you'll notice that they give a whole variety of examples. These are based on real people, but changed enough that they are not the same as what those people would have done. You're going to see a wide variety of layouts. So that's important to know. There's no one way to lay your materials out or to structure your CV. I'm giving you tips or strategies, and I don't always agree with the layouts that are included here. My point is I want to show you that there are a wide variety, that this is a highly subjective process, and ultimately we want to make sure that you're comfortable and confident with your materials and that they're displaying all that you can do. So you start with your name. We've then got your contact information. Now, CVs can feel a bit older. I still encourage you to only include your email address and your cell, because I don't think it's realistic that anyone is going to mail you something as their first point of contact. They're going to email you. So that's one way. It also helps you to kind of take away that additional information they don't need. Now, let's say that you don't need to relocate for the position and you're currently in that same area. It's fine to include your city and state. I would usually just do city and state, not even zip. I don't think they need that. And that just, again, helps to highlight that you would not need to relocate for that position. Your education is always going to be at the top. You'll see in this case, this person has embedded their dissertation, thesis for undergrad, grad, master's, and PhD. And they're also listing who they were supervised by for each of these projects. Now, we immediately see that this is a teaching intensive application because what comes first? Teaching. And so what they've done is try to group their teaching into the kinds of areas they were teaching, whether it's composition or literature. Again, may not make sense for your area. And they give a brief description of how many sections they taught. And at the very top, because they're trying to really emphasize that they've taught a wide variety of courses in many sections, they've summarized 24 sections of 6 different courses. That's a helpful way to show this person has done quite a bit of teaching. They then move on to tutorial experience. So they're trying to, you could even call this advising experience, I would argue. They're trying to highlight the other core component for most teaching intensive institutions, which is your ability to provide that kind of support to students. And so the tutorial experience or advising experience helps to summarize the skill sets that you bring in supporting undergrad or graduate students. They then go into their conference papers or invited talks, fellowships and awards, departmental service, and academic associations. You'll see a lot of references included here. I truly do not believe references belong on a CV. I think that references should be included separately, but that is my perspective. As you would imagine, there's many different CVs are very subjective. The way they're structured is subjective. So I'm just giving you tips, strategies, and what I've seen be effective. Okay, now we're moving into a very different structure, just to give you a sense of all the different ways you might list. So in this case, this person has stacked their education. I think they've done a better job of highlighting their name, not including as much extraneous information. And then they spend a good chunk of time talking about their dissertation. And again, they've defended it with highest distinction at their institution, so they're likely really proud of it. I still think it is a little bit of a lengthy description, but again, depends on your industry. They've also listed their full committee here. They then move into academic employment, AKA their teaching experience section. You'll notice here they're not giving a lot of details. They're just explaining these are all the courses that I taught and how many sections I taught. They've also grouped in their like graduate research assistant experience and their tutorial experience all into one section. They then move into their articles, so you can read. Honors and awards come after that. Conferences, so what they've presented on, and their professional service. Now, remember, when you're thinking what would go under professional service, because I get this question a lot, have you ever been asked to serve on a panel anywhere? That's a service, right? What have you been asked to do that's not explicitly a requirement of your program? Are you supporting the department in any way? Are you supporting graduate students or your fellow graduate students? All of those would be great examples of professional service. And they end with professional affiliations. So you're starting to get a clearer picture of common structures for our teaching intensive institutions. And they end with references, which again, I don't think should be included. Now we're going to shift to a research intensive application. And again, a very different structure. The goal, right, is to show you many different structures so you can determine what makes the most sense for you. So again, we've got a large name. We then immediately move into education. So they are listing, this is helpful also when you're on the job search, especially. So let them know when you defended and when you anticipate graduation so they understand. Certainly once you've successfully defended, that's exciting to them. And when you're graduating, all of that is good news for them when they're when committees are looking through your application. They briefly mention their dissertation. They talk about what they did in their various, what are their research fields and who are their advisors for each of those fields. Again, maybe more common in their discipline than yours. They talk about their thesis in their master's program, and they're including their bachelor's and associates. Like I said, you can absolutely include any higher education that you've completed. They then move into their language capabilities, which is likely very relevant for this field. That's why it's so high up, and what they can speak, read, write for their disciplines. We know that this is research because we're immediately moving into journal articles. They've included other publications, in progress research, and only at that point do we get into teaching experience. So the strategy when it comes to thinking of a teaching intensive versus research intensive is you're essentially swapping to make sure that your teaching experience is up top, then leading into your research for teaching intensives. And for research intensives, you start with your research and then lead into your teaching experience. Otherwise, most of the sections remain in the same order or a similar order. And that's often dependent on your field and what you determine is most important for that field. They've got their teaching experience section. We're not seeing the same depth of information that we were seeing in those more teaching intensive applications. We then move into conferences and presentations, lots and lots of them, professional service, awards and honors. This person has a wild grant, scholarships, and fellowships, so they've gotten lots of money to go to conferences, so excited for them. And you'll notice that these might be some really small awards as well, right? I received, $500 to support me in going to this conference. They're still listing it here to demonstrate their ability to garner funding, which can be really important, especially for research-intensive universities. And they end with professional memberships, community service. So that was a wide variety of different materials, but I think you've likely started to get the sense of how stuff is structured, what are the common areas, and what portions of a CV tend to be towards the bottom versus what portions of CV tend to be towards the top. I encourage you, if you want to dive deeper, to definitely schedule a time with a career engagement specialist or to speak with your advisor. I know when I was going through my doctoral program, one of the components to advance to candidacy was a review of my CV with my chair. So we talked through where I was at, what additional experience I wanted to gain as I was approaching candidacy. So highly encourage, if that's not built into your program, to approach your advisor or someone you trust in the department to provide you that feedback. Now, if you are planning on the academic job search, because yes, this has been a little bit more tailored to the academic job search, there are many documents you might need. These are the most common. So CV, obviously tailored to research or teaching based on the type of institutions you plan to apply to. Your letter of application, kind of similar to a cover letter, but a little bit more in depth. Sample syllabi, potentially, your teaching philosophy and portfolio. This usually is going into your pedagogy, and I encourage you to visit places like Teaching and Learning Center to get additional support in thinking about your teaching philosophy and what you would provide in a portfolio. You're likely going to provide some kind of description of your dissertation, potentially a writing sample. And this says sometimes, but really it's now much more often, a DEI statement. And I know Dr. Judy Estrada is giving you more explicit information about writing that statement. This is just some personal information or some life experience that I've gleaned about the academic job search process so that you're aware of what it looks like, because having lived it, it can be a lot. So the first, and I think one of the more challenging components of the academic job search process, is the timeline for it, which is typically, most positions are being published in, I don't know, anywhere from like August to, it could even be into spring quarter potentially for any late hires. But most of the positions you are applying in fall, at the same time that you're often trying to wrap up your dissertation. So that's the tough part of the academic job search process, is that it really layers on top of your dissertation completion process, which obviously is stressful to do that. So you're balancing completing your research or other research obligations that you have, especially if you have GRA-ships or other kind of funding. That's unless you're fully funded for your dissertation, which is obviously amazing. So you're balancing research, dissertation, and the search process at the same time, and that can be stressful. One component that I want to emphasize, because it was really helpful for many of the folks in my field, is to especially consider conferences during that final year, or, as you approach. That going to conferences and presenting your work is important regardless to advance scholarship, but it's also meaningful for you to be able to build relationships and start to get to know other people. And I know your faculty are likely at these conferences, and you can leverage your faculty or fellow UC graduate students to go to if there's a UC reception. But building those relationships is helpful because they can often tell you about positions that might be coming up, give you any advice or suggestions about the process. And this is not dissimilar from applying for jobs in industry, right? That the networking and the relationships that you've built have a lot of clout in the hiring process. Whether we agree with that or not, it is definitely a fact that there are benefits to attending conferences, benefit to building those relationships. So I would encourage you to prioritize incorporating conferences as you're doing your academic job search. And the final piece is to be open to postdoc positions, right? The benefit or purpose of a postdoc position is to provide you, a couple of years of funding to complete some components of whatever the postdoctoral position requires, while still working on your scholarship, and ideally being supported in your work on your scholarship, so that you gain additional experience teaching and doing research, making you even more competitive when you go back onto the academic job search market. Now, when it comes to the alternative academic search, it is very different. The timeline is way different and often, I would say, a little bit easier compared to the academic search process, right? So if we remember the academic search, you're often applying in fall, maybe you're interviewing in winter or even spring, and the selections are happening in winter or spring, maybe even summer. And you'll know if you got the position and likely not start until August or September, depending on if they're on the quarter or semester system. Outside of the academy, hiring works differently. Most fields have some early hiring, right? There are specific fields that might be doing really early hiring, like 6 months to a year in advance. But many fields are doing what we call just-in-time hiring, meaning I have this position open, I'm advertising it right now because in a couple of months, my goal is to have that position filled. So I'm not typically advertising a job super far in advance from when it would actually be being conducted. So the benefit to you is that often you're wrapping up your dissertation, and spring is really when you would start. Winter and spring would be when you would really concertedly start looking for and applying to opportunities. Now, where do you search? First and foremost, just like we said, conferences were really meaningful for building relationships. I heavily encourage you to come to our career success events. We conduct a lot of events with employers in industry. So it is a great chance for you to build the relationships and get to know folks that are already in industry. And we have specific industry focuses that are not exclusive to undergrads, right? We support undergrads and grad students in their job search process. There are also professional-oriented clubs and orgs on campus. Now, I will admit a number of those are more targeted to undergrads, but I would encourage you to take a look at any of the professional-oriented clubs and orgs to determine if any are exciting to you, because they often will create their own networking opportunities, right? Where they'll bring in folks from industry and you'll have a much smaller group of humans to interact with versus going to large scale events who are actively excited to be supporting that club or organization. So it's a great way to build a relationship and also just get to know some more insider information about that particular industry area. Handshake is where we post all of our full and part-time jobs. So I encourage you to take a look at Handshake for that alternative to the academy, see what's posted. There's typically around 30,000 jobs posted at any given time. So filtering is really helpful to get it targeted to exactly what you're looking for. Indeed is a broader job search platform. That one is going to be broader. You'll have more opportunities listed there, but tends to be pretty accurate in terms of availability. The LinkedIn alumni tool is a separate opportunity that I think Eric from our office is going to talk to you a lot more about. So I'll let Eric explain, but this is a tool for you to look up folks in industry who share an academic background with you, whether that's UCSC or your undergrad institution or any other institutions you've attended. And the benefit is that you can conduct informational interviews, build relationships with them. So what are resources? So of course, professors in your discipline are a number one resource to go to, whether it's your chair, your advisors, or folks outside of UCSC. Chronicle of Higher Ed usually has a variety of opinion pieces and articles. They also have a pretty exhaustive job search tool if you're looking for admin or faculty jobs in higher education. Beyond the Professoriate is a paid resource from GradDiv, so thank you, GradDiv, that can help you to continue to expand how you might apply for opportunities outside of the academy. They hold workshops, conferences, all sorts of cool stuff that is free to you because it's already being paid for by the university. So I encourage you to claim your spot. Teaching and Learning Center, or TLC, is a fabulous resource to advance and think about your pedagogy and approach to teaching and how students learn. So I highly encourage you to get involved with them and seek out some of their professional development they provide for graduate students and faculty. And finally, in career success, you can visit us for CV, cover letter, resume review, career exploration, job search support. We are confidential, so if you're just trying to explore your options or see what's out there, we are happy to meet with you in a confidential space. So if you have any questions, I encourage you to follow up at csuccess@ucsc.edu, and they'll help route you to the right person within our office. Thank you so much for your time, and I wish you all the best as you prep your resumes and CVs.